Hello and welcome to this third and final lesson in this brief series entitled The Promised Messiah. The title of the lesson today is The Promise Fulfilled, and it comes from the first portion of the second chapter of Matthew's Gospel. We previously have established some of the background information around the Gospel of Matthew, written by a Jew, and it reflects a Jewish perspective. It was written by a Jew, and he was writing for a Jewish audience, so it contains a Jewish perspective. The genealogy of Jesus only goes back to Abraham. That's all that would be important to the Jews. And it goes back through through Joseph, Jesus' putative father. And that was important because Jews trace their ancestry through the male. As we said, 16 times in the Gospel, Matthew writes, "And this happened so that it might be fulfilled that which was written," and then quotes Old Testament prophecy. Remember, we said Matthew is showing that Jesus is the Messiah, and as the Messiah, he has to be the son of David. And Matthew is connecting the dots between the Old Testament prophecies and what happened in Jesus' life. And we pointed out that he starts off his gospel with the genealogy, because that was very important to the Jewish reader of that day, that you have the right genealogy. And the genealogy shows that Jesus was the son of David, and he refers to Jesus as being the Messiah. And remember, we said that Matthew probably, as a disciple, as an eyewitness, took Mark's gospel, which was only 606 verses, and expanded it to his gospel, which had 1,068 verses, by repeating most of what Mark said and then adding to it his own observations as an eyewitness. Now, Mark was not an eyewitness. We made the distinction that Mark tells us what Jesus did, where Matthew tells us not only what Jesus did, but also what Jesus said. And so we have a lot of the teachings of Jesus. And in fact, the next 10 lesson series will be on the teachings of Jesus. Now, we've shown that he has been connecting the dots so that his Jewish audience would recognize and accept Jesus as the Messiah. Now, in chapter 2, we're going to pick up after Jesus has been born. Matthew does not give us the details of Jesus' birth. Luke does that. Luke talks about Mary and Joseph being in Nazareth and then traveling to Bethlehem, and then no room in the inn and staying in the stable or the cave, and then the shepherds coming. All of that's out of Luke's gospel. Matthew, after giving us the genealogy, then says after Jesus was born. We just go straight to the point in time after he is born. And that's where our lesson will pick up today. Now, for some background, I need to talk to you about one of the characters of this passage today, and that's Herod the Great. Herod was born in 72 BC to a man by the name of Antipater the Idumean, and an Arab princess. Now, Antipater was an Idumean, and that means he was a descendant of the Edomites. Now, at one point in time in history, the Edomites were forced to accept the Jewish religion. And so while they considered themselves to be Jews, the Jews considered them to be at best half-breeds, because they had Edomite blood in their veins. So they were not respected by the full-blooded Jews. Now, as I said, Herod is born 72 BC to a man by the name of Antipater. Antipater was an aristocrat, a leader living there in Judea, and having been raised and having been converted to Judaism, whether by choice or not, he raises Herod as a Jew. Now, in 63 BC, not long after Herod's born, Pompey, the Roman general, comes in and conquers Judea. And Antipater, Herod's father, was a significant help in the conquering of that area for the Roman army. Now, if you remember, during this time, the Greeks had been ruling, and then the Jews had asserted their independence while the Greeks were fighting the Romans, and now the Romans have defeated the Greeks, and the Romans come back in, and they conquer the area and take control of the area away from the Jewish leadership that had established some of the control. In 47 BC, Antipater is named the governor of Judea. In return for his having helped Pompey conquer the area, he's made the governor of Judea. Now Herod's rise to power, Antipater's son, his rise to power comes because of his father's close relationship with the Romans. And in fact, in 47 BC, at the age of 25, Herod is named as the governor of Galilee, that area to the north. And Herod is a successful governor up there in that he faithfully pays the Roman taxes. He controls the area, and he puts down the bandits that are roaming the area, and he keeps things under control, and the Romans respect that. There was trouble going on in Judea, though. And Antipater was assassinated. He was the governor, and he was assassinated. And there's basically a civil war going on for control. Some of the Jews are siding with the Romans. Some of the Jews are siding with the Jewish leaders that had been deposed. And there was basically a civil war going on. Herod goes to Rome to get help in resolving the civil war. His father, Antipater, had been assassinated. And so Herod goes to Rome, and lo and behold, the Roman Senate named Herod king of the Jews. Then they send him back with an army, and he proceeds to put down the rebellion of the Jewish leadership and take control for Rome. Now, Herod was already married and had a son. He banished that wife and his first son, and he married a Jewish lady, trying to pacify, trying to make friends with the Jewish community, and he was raised as a Jew, and he considered himself a Jew, but remember, the Jews did not consider him as a true Jew. He established himself as the sole ruler in Judea by 37 BC, and he ruled in that capacity until 4 BC. Now let me just read a little bit of what Barclay has to say about Herod. But Herod had one terrible flaw in his character. He was almost insanely suspicious. He had always been suspicious, and the older he became, the more suspicious he grew. In his old age, as he was someone said, he was a murderous old man. If he suspected anyone as a rival to his power, that person was promptly eliminated. He murdered his wife, his Jewish wife, Mary Ann, and her mother, Alexandra. He murdered his oldest son and 2 other sons. He had them assassinated. Augustus, the Roman emperor, said bitterly that it was safer to be Herod's pig than it was to be Herod's son. So, wife, mother-in-law, 3 sons, he feared them as rivals for his power, and the only way to resolve the issue was to murder them. Okay, this gives us something about the character of the man who is the king, the ruler at that time that Jesus is born. Okay, now, based on the writings of some early church historians, we have some discrepancy as to exactly the date of Jesus' birth, as exactly when Jesus was born. Josephus, that early church historian, he says that Herod died soon after the lunar eclipse before the Passover. Now, in going back and checking secular history, there was only one lunar eclipse that occurred right before the Passover, and that was in 4 BC. So it would seem that Herod had died in 4 BC, and that's what most of the history books will record. Now, in the 16th century, the creators of the Gregorian calendar tried to establish a calendar in which 1 BC would be the year that Jesus died. But we know that can't be true, because if he died while Herod was alive, and Herod died in 4 BC, then he obviously, Jesus was obviously born before 4 BC. And in today's lesson, we're going to see that the Magi saw a star which marked his birth, and then traveled to find him. Herod asked them when the star appeared, and while Matthew doesn't give us a direct answer, Herod orders all the children 2 and under to be killed. So it seems that, in fact, this star had appeared 2 years before they had arrived in Jerusalem. Now, if they arrived in Jerusalem and Herod is still alive, and Jesus has been born 2 years before they arrive, that means the birth of Jesus is going to be back sometime around 6 or 7 BC. So you see, it's not so easy for us to pin the exact year in which Jesus was born. Well, let's look at chapter 2 of Matthew's Gospel as he is continuing to connect the dots between Jesus being the Messiah and for his Jewish audience who would be very familiar with the Old Testament prophecy. Chapter 2, verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Okay? We have to rely on Luke, as I said, for all the details of the birth. Matthew goes straight from the genealogy to after Jesus is born. Okay? Jesus has been born, and some time has passed, and now Magi come to Jerusalem looking for Jesus. Now, Matthew starts right off by telling us Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now, that's important. It's not as significant to us, but to the Jewish reader of his day, it would be very important, because that is exactly where they were expecting the Messiah to be born. Bethlehem. Let's talk about Bethlehem. Well, Bethlehem is a small town about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. It's also called Ephrath. The name Bethlehem means house of bread, and that's because it's located in a very fertile area where they grew wheat and barley. Now, technically, the city sat up on a ridge that was some 25 feet above sea level. This ridge had peaks at each end, and then kind of like in a saddle in a depression between those 2 peaks, the city of Jerusalem was located. It had long had a history in biblical writings. It was the place where Jacob buried Rachel back in the Old Testament. It was the place where Ruth and Boaz lived. It was known as the city of David. This is where Jesse lived and raised David as a boy. So it had a history, had a significant history, and as we're going to see, the Old Testament prophets had said that it would be this city that would produce the Messiah. Now, we have to correct the picture that normally comes to our mind when we hear about the birth of Jesus. In our mind, we see a picture of Jesus, Mary and Joseph, in a stable with donkeys sitting around, maybe some sheep there, Jesus lying in a feeding trough, shepherds bowing, wise men bowing. That's the traditional picture we have. Let me read another passage from Barclay, who gives us a little bit better picture or better understanding of what really probably was going on. It said, the picture of the stable and the manger as the birthplace of Jesus is a picture indelibly etched in our minds. But it may well be that picture is not altogether correct. Justin Martyr, one of the greatest of the early fathers, who lived about 150 AD and who came from the district near Bethlehem, tells us that Jesus was born in a cave near the village of Bethlehem. And it may well be Justin's information was correct. The houses in Bethlehem are built on the slope of a limestone ridge, and it is very common for them to have a cave-like stable hollowed out in the limestone rock below the house itself. And very likely it was in such a cave stable that Jesus was born. Okay? So instead of a stable as we normally think of, it was probably a cave. And as we're going to see, the wise men don't arrive until 2 years after, probably 2 years after Jesus' birth, and they go into a house. So the wise men were not at the manger, at the stable, whether it was a stable or a cave. Okay? Matthew tells us, as a matter of timing, that Jesus was born when Herod was the king. Again, since he dies in 4 BC, it had to be at least before 4 BC, maybe as early as 7 or 6 BC. Now, Matthew says that Magi came from the east. He doesn't tell us how many. We traditionally think of 3. And that may be because of the 3 gifts. Some of the traditions say there were 12. We don't know exactly how many Magi came from the east. Matthew does not tell us what gender they were. We traditionally assume they were all male, and very likely so, in as much as it was a man's world in that day. But he doesn't say that. Now, the name Magi is the root word that we get the word magician from. A sorcerer, one who tells the future, one who reads the stars. The earliest reference of this term Magi applied to the religious leaders of the Medes who led in the Zoroastrian worship in Persia. Now, in that particular worship, they worshiped the stars, and they were basically astrologers. They would try to read signs into the stars. Each star would have a specific meaning. Okay? Now, the fact that the early church thought that that's exactly who the Magi were is indicated in that some of the earliest paintings of the nativity scene showed the wise men wearing Persian clothing. So the traditional understanding has been is the Magi were Persian religious leaders, stargazers, astrologers, if you will, who maybe because of the exile had become familiar with the Jewish writings and knew something about the Old Testament prophets. Maybe that's who they were. That's traditionally who we think they may have been. There's a recent study that's come out that says no, there were 12 Magi, and they actually came from China. That they were descendants of Seth, Adam and Eve's third son, and that Seth carried with him a prophecy that one day God would come to earth in the form of a man, and that they were anticipating that. So there is a case to be made that they may have been from as far away as China. But as I said, traditionally we understand them to be the Persian astrologers who, familiar with the Old Testament scripture, saw a star and said this must be the fulfillment of that Old Testament prophecy. Well, they came from the east. Matthew tells us they came from the east. He didn't say whereabouts in the east. One reading of that says that means they were not Jewish. Okay? Secondly, it would mean that they were not Roman or Greek, but rather they were some mysterious people from the east. Now, others suggest that that is not necessarily true, because you see, not all of the Jews returned from Babylon, from exile, when Jerusalem was rebuilt. And there were many, many Jews who remained in Babylon, Persia, Media, and intermarried with the local people and had a mixed worship of Zoroastrianism as well as Judaism. And some suggest that these may be some people with Jewish descent who understood the Old Testament scriptures but also worshiped the stars And they're the Magi that came from the east. Well, Matthew just tells us not how many, but just that 3 have come from the east. Now, the purpose in their coming. Let's read that. He said, and they ask, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. So they have some understanding. They've seen something happen in the sky, something unusual. They knew where the stars normally were placed. They knew the planets. And something appeared out of the ordinary. And for whatever reason, they interpreted that to mean there has been one born to be a king in Judea. So they came and asked, where is this one who has been born as the King of the Jews? We saw his star. We saw something happen in the skies that gave us reason to believe there has been a king born. And we've come to worship him. We've come to pay homage to him. What was going on? What did this Magi see? We don't know what the brilliant star was that the Magi saw. Another Barclay reading. Many suggestions have been made. About 11 BC, Halley's Comet was visible, shooting brightly across the skies. About 7 BC, there was a brilliant conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. In the years 5 to 2 BC, there was an unusual astronomical phenomenon. In those years, on the first day of the Egyptian month Mesori, Sirius, the dog star, rose heliacally, that is, at the sunrise rather than at night, and shone with extraordinary brilliance. Now the name Mesori means the birth of a prince, and to those ancient astrologers, such a star would undoubtedly mean the birth of some great king. We cannot tell what star the Magi saw, but it was their profession to watch the heavens, and some heavenly brilliance spoke to them of the entry of a king into the world. So we can't point to the star or what happened or even to the date. But what the Magi said is they saw some cosmic difference. Something happened in the skies. And they interpreted that to mean there had been a king born, and they've come to worship. Now the Greek word for worship there has the connotation of lying prostrate in submission and reverence. And they said, we've come to worship this king. Well, let's read on. When King Herod heard of this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. We said that the king was absolutely paranoid about power. I mean, to kill his wife, his mother-in-law, and 3 sons because they might rival his power. He was paranoid about power. And as Barclay said, the older he got, the more suspicious he became. This child, as king of the Jews, would present a threat to him. So he was disturbed. But Matthew also says the whole city of Jerusalem was disturbed. This can mean a couple of things. One thought is that when they heard what the Magi said, and they knew how disturbed Herod would be, the people were afraid because they knew how radical Herod was, and they knew he would go to any length to destroy this rival. And they were afraid, one story says, they were afraid that in his insane attempt to eliminate this rival, he would create a disturbance that would get the Romans' attention, and that the Romans would send their armies in to put down any disturbance that Herod was causing. And of course, if the Romans came in, that then would cause trouble for all the Jewish people, and especially the Jewish leaders that would threaten their status as the leaders of the city. So Herod was disturbed, but the people were disturbed with him. So what does Herod do? When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. Now, all the chief priests, and we're saying, well, what does that mean? Well, you see, the chief priest position in Herod's day was a political appointment by Herod. And Herod, for political reasons, would change appointments regularly. So there was a collection of people who had at one point in time served as chief priests, but were no longer chief priests. So he gathers all of these chief priests together, as well as Matthew describes them, the teachers of the law, the scribes, the Pharisees, those who were very, very familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. He calls all of them together and he asks them where the Messiah was to be born. Herod is obviously aware of the expectation of one coming as a Messiah. And he knows that there is some prophecy as to where this child would be born. But he doesn't know it himself. He doesn't know what the prophecy said. He just knows that there was an expectation and people had pinned it down. So he calls these people who would be very familiar with the Old Testament and asks them where the Messiah was to be born. And they responded, in Bethlehem in Judea. They replied, for this is what the prophet has written. Here's another one of those positions of Matthew quoting from an Old Testament prophet. And this time he's quoting from Micah chapter 5, to verses 2 through 4. But in you, Matthew quoting Micah, Matthew wrote, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, Matthew quoting Micah. Let's read what Micah wrote. This is the actual verses from Micah. And it's Micah chapter 5, and it's verses 2 and verses 4. In verse 2, Micah wrote, but you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, remember I said that Bethlehem went by that other name, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. And then in verse 4, he says of this one, he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach out to the ends of the earth. So, Matthew, quoting from Micah, says that this one is to be born in Bethlehem, and he is going to shepherd the people of Israel. Herod, now getting the answer, calls the Magi back. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. Now, by calling them secretly, what it means is he did not call them while he still had the chief priests, had the scribes, the scholars with him. And he didn't call him in a public setting because he has a plan. And his plan is he's going to tell them what the scholars have said. But first of all, he wants to know, when did you first see this star? And he secretly found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. So he tells them the answer that he's gotten. He sent them to Bethlehem. Now, he doesn't tell them what his plans are. He lies to them. He says, you go and find him and worship him, and then come back and tell me, because I'm going to go worship him too. Now, anybody that knew Herod knew that's not what he wanted to do. But these Magi didn't know that. So he gives them this instruction. Now, as I said, Matthew doesn't tell us the answer to Herod's question when he asked the Magi, when did the star first appear? We translate, or we take the statement later made about killing the children 2 years of age and younger to say that the Magi must have told him it had been about 2 years. And that would be accounting for the travel they had done since they saw the star and had made their way to Jerusalem. So, he sends them on their way, and he tells them to come back and tell him when they find him. He's being deceptive. Well, look what happens. After they heard the king, the Magi, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it arose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Now, scholars tell us that we need to understand the way this is written. It doesn't necessarily mean that the same star that they saw upon Jesus' birth had actually moved across the sky and led them to this point in time, and now reappears and moves across the sky to lead them to Bethlehem. But rather what it's suggesting is the star that appeared 2 years earlier that caused them to decide there had been a king born, that same star now reappears and reappears over the place where the child is. And that leads them. They see that star again, haven't seen it in 2 years, they see that star again now, and they go to Bethlehem where the star is over the place where the child is. So he says, after they had heard the king, they went on their way. The star they had seen when it rose ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. They saw the star ahead of them, and they got there, and there the star was over the child. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. When they saw the star again, they were overjoyed. They hadn't seen it for a while. Now they realize their mission is going to be completed. This star that told them a child had been born now has led them to the child. They were overjoyed that it has reappeared and that success is coming. And it says, Matthew says, and they entered the house. 2 years later, after Jesus' birth, they're not still living in a cave or a stable. They've actually moved into a house. Notice that Matthew says that they saw Mary and the baby. He didn't say anything about Joseph. Evidently, Joseph is out working. They've decided to stay in Bethlehem for a while, and Joseph is trying to earn some money. They're living in a house. They have to pay rent, etc. So they come in the house, and they see Mary and the child in the house. And they bowed down to worship. They bowed down in worship. And then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Worship. Bowing down. Showing submission. Now giving of your possessions. Worship. And the giving of the gifts. Gold, a gift that you would give a king. Frankincense, the gift you would give a priest for use in the worship service. Myrrh, a spice that was used to embalm the dead, so it'd be something you would give to one who is going to die. And we see how all of these apply to this child who came to be a king, a priest, but who was going to die. They give him these gifts. And then, Matthew tells us, having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Obedience to God's instruction, even though they were not worshipers of God, even though they didn't know what this meant, they got instructions to go back a different way. And they did not go back and tell Herod anything. God warned them not to go back, and they obeyed, and they went a different route. Now, of course, in the following verses, we find out that Herod, when he finds out that they have not come back, that he has been tricked, he then issues the order that all male children under the age of 2 in that area should be killed. Well, we have a lesson about the fulfillment, Matthew's accounting of the fulfillment of the promise. In that first lesson in this series, we had the promise foretold. Then last week we saw Matthew connecting the dots between the Old Testament and this Jesus. And now we have the story that the promise of the coming of the Messiah has been fulfilled. And he's connecting the dots still, because that coming of the Messiah was in Bethlehem, just exactly as the Old Testament prophet Micah had said. These Magi, whomever they were, wherever they came from, they were receptive to the message from God. And they came to worship this new king. They came to show their submission to this new king. They came with gifts giving to this new king. And then are obedient in going away, going home on a path different than going back to Jerusalem and telling Herod what they'd found. The contrast we make between the Magi and the people who really should have been excited about the birth of the king. The Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, they should have been excited when they heard that a king had been born in Bethlehem. They should have anticipated that this was the fulfillment of the promise. But they didn't. They were too busy with their own activities, too impressed with their own status as leaders in the Jewish religious community. They were too caught up in their practice of religion to appreciate that the king has been born, that they don't accept him. They won't accept him. During his whole life, they don't accept him. Isn't it interesting how a Magi can come and worship, but the ones who should have been anticipating the promise are too busy, too caught up to pay attention that the promise has been fulfilled. The lesson there, we can get so caught up in our daily lives, even playing church. We can get so caught up that we fail to see God working his plan in our lives. We fail to recognize what he is doing in us and through us. Oh, may we be as open as the Magi to respond. May we be as obedient in worship as the Magi to submit and to give of all that we have. This is the promise fulfilled. Oh, that we can recognize God fulfilling his promises in our lives. He does, if we will be open to allow him to work in us and through us to accomplish his will. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you for your promise that you would enable and equip us that we can live these lives of obedience and submission and worship. We realize we can't do it in our own. It's not anything we do on our own, but it is your Spirit living in us, equipping us, and enabling us. Father, this week, may we be very sensitive to your working in our lives. Help us to avoid being so busy that we fail to recognize your leadership and your working. Father, for what you have done for us, we thank you and praise you, and what you are doing and are going to do, we thank you and praise you in advance. For it's in the name of the coming King, even Jesus the Messiah, we pray. Amen. Thank you.